Welcome to the Business Trendsetter podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
I'm here today reporting from Panang, Malaysia. I'm at the Bayview Resort overlooking the Malacca Strait here. And I've been here for 4 or 5 days, Adam, and I've just been noticing a lot of interesting things here as I'm on here for business. The people here are very, very hungry for additional abundance in their life. They really want to work hard. They're willing to do the work. Work ethic is pretty amazing. I learned that unemployment is very, very low. And there's some shifts happening in the semiconductor industry. This is kind of why I'm here, which all point to things happening in the U.S. It's all an interconnected network. One thing happens in the U.S. and these big semiconductor giants that affects the world here and vice versa. So just thinking about the number of cars out here and there is quite a bit of pollution actually, kind of brings me to the discussion about electric cars. One of my Grab drivers, and so Grab is actually a competitor to Uber, and actually beat out Uber about a year ago, and they actually kicked him out of Malaysia, is what the term that is used. And so the Grab driver, he was very excited to pick up an American, and was asking me questions. And one of the things he asked me is about a Tesla. He asked me if I had a Tesla, and I said I do not. And he asked me a bunch of questions. So he was very excited, and it kind of brought to the stage here the conversation we're having today with respect to electric cars.
Sure. Well, you know what I like to say to people: get outside the box, then think. And your opportunity to go to Malaysia gives you that opportunity to get outside the box. The box that's the United States, that's Arizona, that the world you live in. And all of us have that. We have our jobs, we have our locations, and you get sort of stuck in the way you think, and it creates biases. And I think it's just wonderful whenever somebody has that opportunity to go do business somewhere else for a little while, and you start saying, "Whoa, wait a minute. What have I been taking as the norm? Is the norm really the norm, or is it just the norm where I am? And is there other ways that we can get things done?" Now, as far as cars, so like if you go to Thailand, they have this thing called a tuk-tuk, which is this sort of open air three-wheeled motorcyclish type product, and then they have a lot of those in India as well. Do they have the two-cylinder open air transportation devices in Malaysia?
They actually don't. I haven't seen any at all. But what I can say is they have their own car brand, and what they did is they actually formed a company. They use a lot of products from Daihatsu, which is a Japanese company, of course. Daihatsu's, they came into the U.S. briefly. They didn't last very long. But here, every Grab driver is driving one of these cars. So it's kind of amazing. They have their own little mini market, their own little segmented market,
Yep.
and they own it. They own it.
Yep. Yep. But if you think about it, when you're in that part of the world, and if you roll the clock back 40 years, they needed to get transportation. How are you going to make it happen? And you're sort of like, well, the price of a Chevrolet 40 years ago was just not within reach of anybody except the wealthiest of their country. So you say, well, how are we going to get people mobile so we can become part of the modern world? And what you do is you go to some kind of company like Daihatsu. Usually it was a Japanese company at the time, and you make a deal. Say, hey, look, basically, let's build the cars in our country. We need the jobs. You supply the parts. You supply the engineering. Let us get the jobs. And let's put some transportation out there on the roads. And it isn't as competitive as the United States, but, it really does work. And that's the part that I think people struggle with sometimes, is they think that, well, the only way you can do this is the U.S. way of doing things. And as you've seen there in Malaysia, the U.S. way isn't the only way. And a lot of these other alternatives can work quite well also.
Yeah, and a lot of it is just about identifying that the customer need, right? It's the same thing we talk about everywhere. And I was fortunate enough to bump into an entrepreneurial networking group. I had a meeting in the morning, and the afternoon I had free. I looked on Facebook, found a group called E3 Hub, which is entrepreneurs helping. Entrepreneurs empowering entrepreneurs was the name of the group. And there was 150 people there, and they had speakers, and it was pretty amazing. And they talked about the same things you and I talk about. The guy stood up there, talked about trends. He talked about customer development, understanding your customer, market need, the invisible hand. I mean, he went through the gamut of all these things happening. I mean, it was pretty amazing.
And I want our listeners to notice that Manny used social media in a foreign country in order to, advance his thinking and advance his work. And I hear so often people say, "Oh, Facebook isn't for business." They're not trying, right, Manny?
They're not trying. They're not trying. As a matter of fact, this group, the gentleman that I met with, actually had dinner with him last night. He's actually worked with 8,000 startups in his career.
Wow.
And he actually has one of those what became a unicorn, the fabled $1 billion valuation that exited. And I mean, he wants to really build this network in the South Pacific here, especially in Malaysia and the Philippines, where he says that people are just they're very hungry for growth, and they want that abundance. He kept on using that word abundance. People here live in very modest means. I mean, you can see some very expensive cars running around every once in a while, but most people are pretty happy and content at the probably the equivalent of the working class in the U.S. So they're pretty happy, but they want more.
Could you imagine living there?
Yes, I could
See,
definitely imagine living.
I
Look,
have that same reaction usually.
the food is
I,
amazing. The people are amazing. So what's interesting about Malaysia in particular is it's an Islamic country. So you hear that, and from the West, of course, we have certain things that we imagine that might be. We imagine Sharia law and a bunch of other things, but it's not the truth. So the truth is their official religion is Islam, but it
yeah,
doesn't mean they're an Islamic country. So that's a very important designation. And so here you've got at least four different groups that coexist. You have the original Malays that are here. They're usually Muslim. You have the Chinese that are usually Buddhist, and by the way, they identify themselves as Chinese or Buddhist, or I'm sorry, or Indian. You have a pretty sizable Indian community, and they're Hindu, of course. And then you've got a Christian. Is probably number four, and they all coexist. And they don't. There's no civil unrest. And I asked some questions, and they said no. We just do our thing, and we don't mess with each other. If you go into an Islamic neighborhood, you don't bring pork in there. You just don't. And the guy was like, "Don't be stupid." You know,
yeah.
if you and same for the other neighborhoods. And so it's just I like the culture a lot.
Well, one of the things that, again, you just pointed out is the value of immigration. We have this anti immigration philosophy among a lot of people in the United States. And the reality is, if the Malay had not been very active with an immigration policy, their country wouldn't be anything. There weren't enough Malay, and they couldn't have enough children to be on the world stage. And so, by opening their borders and allowing immigrants from China, from India, and from other countries to come in, it made it so that they could grow their economy. And of course, Kuala Lumpur is one of the banking centers of the entire world now. And there's a lot of modern things happening. As you said, semiconductor plants being built, all that good stuff. But we can credit a lot of that. The Malay can credit a lot of that to their very open immigration policy, wanting people to come in, wanting people to work. And we sit in the United States and we say, "Oh, immigrants are bad." Right now in the news, there's this big fight between the Texas governor and the president of the United States because the governor's trying to put buoys in the middle of the Rio Grande River, trying to stop people from coming into the country. And you keep looking at this and saying, "Well, you're going to end up like China. You're going to end up like these European countries where there just aren't enough people to support the retirees, and your economy can't grow if you don't have immigration." If you look at the long-term statistics in the U.S., it isn't having babies that's actually made the U.S. a really strong, growing economy. It's been immigration from the
Yeah.
beginning, from the days when we beat up and killed off all the Native Americans and turned it into a European country. But Europeans came in, Asians have come in. For years, it's been like that, and that's the most. It's great wonder what it's done for the Malay, and it would be great for our country if people could get their heads out of their buttocks and start realizing immigrants are good for your country. They grow your economy. Like you said, they're ready to work. They're absolutely ready to work. There are a lot of people in Florida and in Georgia and in California that hire Mexican workers legally hire them. They've come across the border. They put them to work for 2, 3 weeks. There's a set of laws in the United States about hiring these people, paying them, and then the people go back to Mexico to work. And universally, they're doing agricultural jobs. I'm sure this is true in Phoenix. I'm sure it's true in Tucson. And so when they're interviewed, they say, we cannot get Americans to do these jobs. It's outside, it's hot, it's backbreaking work, it's tough work, and we cannot get Americans to do this work. So we have these people come in from Mexico and do the work. And some people in America just shrug that off like it's not important when it's really important. You wouldn't have fresh tomatoes if you didn't have somebody out there picking them. You wouldn't have the fresh oranges and the fresh pineapples and all the good food and a lot of the hard work that we have to do to take care of our animal husbandry. So, I think, again, get outside the box, go to Malaysia, and you suddenly say, wait a minute, why are we fighting immigrants so much? Look at how well this can work if we just have the right attitude.
It's a big difference. One of the gentlemen that was on a panel at that hub I went to owns a glove manufacturing company, and he's the youngest founder of a glove manufacturing company in Malaysia, and he was very frank. He said that of course, unexpectedly, the pandemic happened, and they were killing it, hand over fist, pun intended. And he said that once the pandemic started to peter out, that he was faced with some serious problems. Which, of course, we've talked to other people about this as far as being able to pivot, and you're not going to have that same success one day by providing one product, and then the market changes and expect that same thing to provide you down the road. And so we had a good conversation, and they're looking at some new things that I think will definitely take them to the next level.
But see, again, you're a member of Vistage, I know, and you know that I do a lot of talks with Vistage groups, and we get into these talks, and we're talking to members of, and they universally are small, middle-sized companies, and we start talking about how the world changes and how you have to be ready to pivot. And there's always this resistance in America. There's this resistance to the idea of, oh, today I made gloves, tomorrow I'm going to, I don't know, make shoes or car parts. And we kind of think we should be somehow we think we should be able to just keep doing what we did, more, better, faster, cheaper, and everything will work out fine. That somehow that's the American way. And what you see there in Malaysia, somebody says, hey, I built a plant, I made gloves. I made a lot of money making gloves. Nobody wants gloves. What do I got to make now? Where do I go now? What's the trend? What do I jump on now? I've gone to India several times, and it's that same phenomenon when you're in India. You walk into somebody and you talk to them, and you can say, well, what do you do? And often the answer will be, what do you need? It's kind of like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you, I don't want you to think I'm 4 inches wide. I'll be 4 miles wide. I'll do whatever you need.
Right.
Let me help you out. Well, can there's something I can do for you? I'm ready to start up a new company if that's what I have to do, or I'll change this company if that's what I have to do. And it's just so open-minded, and around the world, people, they've had to do that to be successful, right? They couldn't just, if you tried to rely on building a plant for IBM, you'd be broke because, they come and they go. They come and they go. Yeah. Americans are not very loyal when it comes to international business transactions. We're ready to jump to the next low-cost country. So the leaders there, the business leaders, they have to be eyes wide open. What do my customers want? What do they need? What can I do to try to make sure that I keep this plant busy and I can keep selling product? And, that, like you said, I have the same phenomenon when I go around the world. And even when I go to these tier 2 countries and these other places, in that I find that I get very excited. I enjoy it. Everything's different. The food's different. The customs are different. Greetings are different. Everything's different. And I get energized by that. It makes me excited. And I always think, man, if somebody wanted me to come here and live and work, I would probably do it in a heartbeat. I'd be all over it. It reminds me, though, this is sort of an outlier. About 10 years ago, I was at a National Association of Corporate Directors function. This guy who ran Match.com was the guest speaker. And he was talking about a lot of things they did to grow the company and go public and different things. And so anyway, he says the one question he always gets asked is, how can you best know if two people are going to be a good match? And he said, I always end every presentation by answering that question. He says, there's 2 questions of all the questions we ask people. There's 2 that are the most reliable at telling if somebody will match. The first one is, do you like horror movies? And either you do or you don't, but you rarely will one person like a horror movie and the other one not. That you have to be simpatico and do you like horror movies? The second one was, have you ever gone to a foreign country alone? And it took me a while but I thought of that, when I was like young, I was ready to go places. I got out of school. I was ready to jump on a plane and go to France. I didn't speak the language. I didn't care. I'm ready. Let's go see what France is like. I want to go see this. I want to go to Canada. I want to go to Mexico. I want to go see these things. And Mary Lou, who's been with me now for over 10 years, same way. I found out when she got out of school, and they gave her an opportunity. She was ready to go to these countries. Now you're ready to go get on a plane and go to these countries. But I've learned since then, I've kind of paid attention and I listen to people talk. And I've found out that the majority of people in America don't do that. That I have kind of a biased circle of friends who are like you and I, and
Yeah.
we're like, hey, let's go find the opportunity, let's move. But it turns out the majority of people don't get that excited to leave the country. And if they do, they
Right.
think they'll go once or twice in their life. And if they do, they want to go with somebody they know. They don't want to
Right.
go alone. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of just an antidote, but it does get to this American way of thinking about sort of, well, I'm in America and that's all that matters. And, we just got to take care of America and not thinking about the fact that, as you said, it's really a bunch of dominoes and one falls over and another falls over and something happens in the U.S. and that causes something to happen in Penang. And it's all connected.
It's
And
all
in a
connected.
real way, yeah. In a real way, another anecdote about 30 years ago, I was doing a project with the Department of Defense. I was at the DuPont companies working with the Department of Defense. And one day there's a dinner, and it's all of us are bizarre, but the former head of the CIA was at the dinner, not the current at the time, a former, because he was a friend of somebody that was there. So we're sitting there talking, and the conversation gets to Vietnam because he had been head of CIA during the Vietnam War era. And he said, he gets asked this question all the time. He says, what about the Vietnamese? And he said, oh, there's no doubt in my mind. They're definitely smarter than us. And he was just as deadpan flat, as earnest as he could possibly be. He said, if you think that Americans with their biases can go toe to toe against the fleet-footed people of Asia, who have proven over 1,000 years that they can maintain their culture, yet they immigrate, yet they go out and work with other countries that have global responsibilities, and they tie into them, and it gets very interconnected. And he said they've been doing that for 1,000 years. And he said, and here we sit back thinking, because we have a 200-year-old country at the time, 200-year-old country, he says, like, we know it all. And he said, no, no way, no way. Those people know it
Yeah.
much better than we do.
I'd agree with that. With that event I went to, there was a microcosm of what you and I see every day in the U.S. as far as companies and startups, whatever. There was a microcosm there. There was a company doing crowdfunding. There was a company that was doing a new kind of a billing format, kind of like a Stripe or one of these Square things. There was a some hospitality companies doing some new ways to book travel. I mean, these are the same things we see. It's just a smaller, different framework. And I was very pleased to see that because it's like sometimes we think, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's a third world country or second world country. No, they're just as much innovators as you and I see every day.
And also, if you take a look at these simple things, we get off of an airplane anywhere in the world and we speak English, right? I mean, in my generation in particular, when I was going to school, I was not required to take a foreign language, and I didn't take a foreign language. And it wasn't until I got out of school altogether and I was working in France, I started to learn French. And they used to joke all the time. They say, you go to somewhere and you meet somebody who speaks three languages, they're trilingual. They speak two languages, they're bilingual. If they speak one language, they're an American.
Yeah,
That's what the foreigners would say all the time. And now think about that. You're in Malaysia doing business in English. And almost all those people were born speaking a different language, right? They have to not only learn how to be business people, they have to learn how to be business people and then successfully interact in English so they can talk to us, so they can, but even, business English has become the language of business. So if somebody from France or somebody from Italy or Germany shows up and wants to talk about building a semiconductor plant, they'll have to do that, probably some of that in English as well. And they're going to have to meet with you, Manny, from America. And the next 2 weeks from now, they might well be meeting with the German contingent, right?
right.
And so
Yeah,
they'll have to kind of understand the differences in those, and customs and traits and the way people interact and get things done. So the amount of obstacles that they face is so much higher than the obstacles we have in America. Even raising money in America, you can crowdsource to raise money. You can go to a private equity firm, a venture capitalist, a family office. There's so many ways you can raise. But these people are living in Malaysia. They can't go to an American family office to raise money, right? I mean, they're sitting there. How do we do this? They have to work with the local people. Then they have to try to have these events like you're talking about. See if they can lure people to come in that might have some money to do investments. They have to work 10 times harder to build their
right.
economy. they're not sitting around crying about it. You
We're
know, they're
not.
just out
No.
there making it happen.
Yeah, I'm very impressed, but with the modality, the
So
way
now
they
we're
think.
going to talk about cars, but before, I'm not even sure we're going to have time for that today, because what I want to do now is kind of shift over a little bit, talk about these countries and the economy. So I looked it up today, and the inflation in Malaysia is 2.8%. Okay. So that is a full percentage point lower than it is right now in the United States. And it is actually where Jerome Powell says he wants our inflation to get. He says 2 to 3%. So if you look at Malaysia, they don't have an inflation problem by the definition of Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve. Now, how can that be? How could this country that's been out there that was, I mean, their tourist industry got shattered, completely shattered
Right.
during the pandemic, that people couldn't travel over to talk about building new plants or anything else. The extent we thought we had went into a standstill, their problems were 10 times greater, right? Yet here they are coming back, roaring back, and they're not facing a big problem with their inflation. So I did a little more digging around, and what I was starting to look at was to see that there's actually three countries with inflation that's between 3.5% and 4%, and that's the United States, Canada, and Japan, right? And those four countries are all America's is the highest at 4. The other two are at 3.2 and 3.5%. So we have three countries here with pretty low inflation. Then in the next four countries, what you see is that the inflation is greater. So in Italy, for example, in France it's 5%, Germany's 6, Italy is 7.5, and the UK is 8. So the first thing I want to point out here is we keep looking at inflation like it's a U.S. situation, right? And so because all the Federal Reserve can do is control the money supply of the United States. That's it. It can't set interest rates. It can just control the money supply. And by controlling the money supply, it causes interest rates to go up and down. But the Federal Reserve is the bank of last resort, the bank that protects all the other banks in the United States. It is a bank, so it deals only with currency. And if the problems with inflation were strictly a currency problem, like happened in the 1980s when we lost control of the currency and were printing way too much of it, then why would all these other countries have inflation? Obviously, the problem isn't limited to, it's not just a currency situation, right? And obviously, Malaysia, you can say, look, what's happening is, if you take a look at it, Japan, Canada, and the United States are growing much better than the other four countries. And so the growth of the economy is allowing the inflation rate to be lower. So where we have a Federal Reserve trying to restrict the money supply, saying they want wages to not go up, and saying that they want jobs, they want fewer jobs. Like we don't want that everybody going to work. We need more unemployment so that we can get rid of inflation. It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous because when you look at it, it's the growth of the economy that in fact has kept us from having this inflation. These
Yeah.
other, UK's gotten killed. Why? Because, well, Brexit shut them off from the European Union. They no longer have access to the European Union for their goods and services. They don't have free trade. They don't have free trade with us. They chose to isolate themselves in the most nationalistic way possible with Brexit, and they suffer the worst. The food inflation in the UK, food inflation is 17.5%. Yeah, in the United States, our overall inflation is 4%, but our food inflation is a much lower number. It's like 7%, something like that, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is that the real issue we're dealing with here is economic growth and to an extent demographics and then the supply chain, right? So you have in Japan a difficulty with demographics, Canada and the US some difficulty with demographics. But what they're doing is businesses are finding ways to grow. And so we're creating 200,000 plus jobs every single month. And the Federal Reserve think that's a bad thing. And I just don't get that because if you
Yeah.
look at Malaysia, they don't have it. They're 2.8, right? So they're below that 3% threshold. And are they trying to restrict their money supply? Are they saying, oh, we need more unemployment? Oh, we need to shut
No.
down the walls and keep the immigrants out? You think all the things that people say we need to do to kill inflation, they're not doing any of that in Malaysia, and yet they don't have it.
No, and they're thriving. They're building. There's as we were. I was in Island here, where they have the Intel plant, and they're building a new fab. There's cranes, big cranes everywhere. There's construction guys everywhere. It's a different modality, like you said, different way of thinking. That here there's not a restrictive mode of thinking. I'll just say it that
Yeah.
way. They see the immigrants. They see people. They see people like me. I mean, I'm 6'3". I stick out like a sore thumb. I'm not blonde hair, blue eyed, but otherwise, people know that I'm not from around here, and they're just
Right.
friendly. They're curious. They want to know, hey, where you're from, what do you do, and even the grab drivers that are blue collar are asking about Teslas and how is it to do what you do, and I mean it's just a different mindset.
And I want people to understand that when we start talking about inflation, the most people have no idea what the word means. Okay, inflation means prices go up, but prices of what? Okay, food goes up, everybody gets upset about it, right? But at the same time, food prices have gone up like 6%. The cost of energy, which is predominantly gasoline, right, that you put in your car, has dropped 12% over the last year. So the decline in the price of gasoline has offset rises in the cost of some other things like garments and food. So, inflation isn't just one number that we try to say at 4%. It's actually all these different pieces. And one of the most misunderstood is housing. To the Federal Reserve, to the census people, the people who do the analysis, bring all the numbers together to say inflation, all of us are renters. Think about that for a minute. What that means is they don't say, okay, you own a house. They say all of us are renters. So what happens is now I own a house, used to. You own a house. You go up and down the street, you see people that own houses, right? The reality is they bought that house for $500,000, $1 million, whatever they paid for that house, and that's the cost of their house. It didn't go up last year. And in fact, in California, you have places where, because of Proposition 13, which is a very big tax abatement, people are third generation living in a house. So the house was handed down to them. So they're living in a house that has a tax basis of, say, $25,000 that will be right next to a house on a tax basis of $2.25 million. Again, it's due to Proposition 13 passed in the 1970s. So, but to the inflation statistic guys, the person living in that house who's never made a mortgage payment in their life because the house was handed down to them, they don't have a mortgage payment, they don't have any interest payment. To them, that house went up in value, and so therefore that family suffered from inflation. See how ridiculous that is? The vast majority of people in the United States are homeowners, they're not renters. And so, because of that, we have this inflation number that was jacked up a lot because housing prices went up at the end of the pandemic. Remember, interest rates were near zero. People were running around trying to buy houses before the pandemic ended because they're like, I want to buy a house so I can get a mortgage for 2%. They locked all that in. So, for most people, housing isn't going up. Now, can we find stories of people that are renters whose rent have gone up? Of course we can. We can find people being thrown out of their houses and the landlords jacking up the rents 40%. Sure, that exists. And sure, that's a problem for those people. That's absolutely a problem for those people. But the reality is, for most people, there is no housing inflation because they're locked in on the house they live in.
Yeah,
But now back to that again, you start saying, well, okay, we have a housing problem. We have all these people living on the streets. What we really need to do if the price of housing is going up is we need to build a lot more houses, right? But not necessarily houses, but multifamily type
right.
architecture, get people back off the streets into homes. But yet our zoning, we zone that down. When people in the zoning job sit there and say, well, most Americans want to see single family homes. They don't want a multifamily home anywhere near where they live. So we're not going to let people build multifamily housing because we want to keep the people happy whose houses are not costing them any more money because they locked the price of that house in
Yeah,
5, 10, 20 years ago, maybe even longer. So people need to look at this inflation thing entirely differently. I want to come back to it again. The number one reason that we have this inflation is supply chain. Whenever the pandemic ended, the economists were dumb enough, they kind of like, oh, it's going to end and everything's going to go back to normal. Well, no, took us 3 years to go through the pandemic. It's going to take us more than that to come back. We've got to reopen these plants. And then for somebody who shut his plant to reopen the plant, he's got to say, look, I got to make a profit on this. So I'm going to jack my prices up to do it. For somebody who sat there and said, I kept my plant open, but I went down 50%. All of a sudden the orders are pouring in. Well, I can't fulfill all these orders. I want to raise prices. That was what you would expect to have happen. And the Federal Reserve can't do anything about that. Now that those plants are coming on, now that the good people of Malaysia are building plants, and now that people like you are over there talking about how do we build semiconductor plants and how we're going to make this thing happen, the supply is coming back. And as the supply comes back, the economy growth comes back, and the inflation rates are going down. And it doesn't have jack to do with the idiots in the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell. He is a fool.
yeah.
Is
I
that clear
agree.
enough?
I agree with you. One of the big topics, just to sort of go in a slightly different direction, one of the big topics here at this conference I'm at, which is a semiconductor conference, of course, has to do with AI. And they're
Yeah.
talking about AI at the chip level. They're talking about they call it network on chip. So they're building rather than have a chip and then next to it have a network chip that communicates, they're actually putting the network on the original chip, the processor. And the layman, the idea here is for the layman that it's going to make decisions happen much faster, communication happen much faster, and it's going to be enabling AI to really take a stronger foothold in our everyday life. And, we talked about this ad nauseum about AI. It's nothing to be scared of. It's just something to embrace as a new tool, just like the internet was, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. People were scared about the internet, and here we are on the internet having these discussions.
Well, every single day, there's more than one article that crosses my computer about the dangers of AI and how we could end up wiping out humanity. Every single day, this happens, right? And the reality is, you cannot stop what is going to happen. It is out of the box. Artificial intelligence is out there, and you're sitting right there at the front of it. Hey, we're going to put this right on a chip. We're going to make it happen, and nobody is going to stop that. So all the crying that they want to do, and all the, last week the president of the United States brings in brings in leadership from Google and these companies. It's like, oh, we got to do something to stop this or slow this down. I just wake up, folks. This is the modern world. You're not going to stop it. You're not going to slow it down. It's going to happen, and it's a global thing, and it's going to affect every single business. And they better quit crying about it and act like a Malay and go out there and make something happen.
Very well said, Adam. Very well said. Well, thanks for your time. And we'll be talking to you next week. I'll be back in Tucson, and I'm sure we'll have some more discussions about what's happening in the world as it pertains to trends.
Enjoy your time outside the box, Manny.
Thank you. Will do. Cheers.